Module 2, Different Types of P/E Ratios. There are different variations of the P/E ratio that investors use to assess a company's valuation. Two common variations are the trailing P/E ratio and the forward P/E ratio. Let's explore each of them. Trailing P/E ratio. The trailing P/E ratio, also known as the historical P/E ratio, is calculated using past earnings data. It reflects the relationship between the current market price of a stock and its earnings over the previous 12 months. The formula for the trailing P/E ratio is, trailing P/E ratio equals market price per share / earnings per share, EPS. For the past 12 months, the trailing P/E ratio provides a backward-looking assessment of a company's valuation based on its historical earnings. It is useful for comparing a company's valuation with its own historical levels or with industry averages. However, it does not account for future earnings growth expectations. Forward P/E ratio. The forward P/E ratio, also known as the estimated P/E ratio, incorporates analysts' earnings forecasts for future periods. It represents the relationship between the current market price of a stock and its expected earnings in the upcoming 12 months. The formula for the forward P/E ratio is, forward P/E ratio equals market price per share / estimated earnings per share, EPS. For the next 12 months, the forward P/E ratio provides a forward-looking assessment of a company's valuation based on anticipated future earnings. It takes into account analysts' expectations and growth projections. Investors use the forward P/E ratio to evaluate whether a stock is relatively overvalued or undervalued based on future earnings expectations. It's important to note that the accuracy of forward P/E ratios heavily depends on the accuracy of earnings forecasts, which can be subject to uncertainty and revisions. Both the trailing and forward P/E ratios have their own merits and limitations. The trailing P/E ratio is based on historical data and provides a reference point for comparison, while the forward P/E ratio incorporates future expectations. Investors often consider both ratios to gain a more comprehensive understanding of a company's valuation and its growth potential. It's worth mentioning that variations of the P/E ratio can also include adjusted P/E ratios, which account for one-time or non-recurring items that may distort the earnings figure. Adjusted P/E ratios provide a more accurate representation of a company's ongoing earnings power by excluding exceptional or non-operational items. Ultimately, investors should analyze the P/E ratios in conjunction with other financial metrics, industry comparisons, and qualitative factors to form a well-rounded assessment of a company's valuation. The differences between the variations of the P/E ratio, namely the trailing P/E ratio and the forward P/E ratio, lie in the data they utilize and the time frames they represent. Here are the key distinctions and their respective applications. Trailing P/E ratio calculation. The trailing P/E ratio is computed using historical earnings data from the past 12 months. Application. The trailing P/E ratio is primarily used for historical analysis and comparative purposes. It helps investors assess a company's valuation relative to its past performance or compare it to industry peers over a common historical period. It provides insights into how the market has valued the company's earnings in the recent past. Limitation. Since the trailing P/E ratio relies on historical data, it may not capture changes in a company's future prospects or earnings growth. It does not account for potential shifts in the business environment or forthcoming events that may impact future earnings. Forward P/E ratio calculation. The forward P/E ratio is based on analysts' earnings estimates for the next 12 months. It incorporates future earnings projections. Application. The forward P/E ratio is used to evaluate a company's valuation based on expected future earnings. It helps investors assess whether the current market price is justified given the anticipated earnings growth. By comparing the forward P/E ratio with the trailing P/E ratio or industry averages, investors can identify discrepancies between current valuation and future expectations. Limitation. The accuracy of the forward P/E ratio depends on the reliability of analysts' earnings forecasts. These forecasts can be subject to revision and uncertainty. Additionally, the forward P/E ratio does not consider longer-term factors beyond the next 12 months, potentially overlooking the company's long-term growth potential. The choice between the trailing and forward P/E ratios depends on the investor's objectives and time horizon. Trailing P/E ratios are useful for historical analysis and identifying trends, while forward P/E ratios provide insight into future earnings expectations. Both ratios can be used in conjunction to gain a more comprehensive understanding of a company's valuation. It is important to recognize that the P/E ratio variations should not be viewed in isolation. Other factors, such as industry dynamics, company-specific circumstances, management quality, competitive landscape, and macroeconomic conditions, should also be considered when evaluating a stock's valuation, certainly. I'll explain how to calculate and interpret each type of P/E ratio, the trailing P/E ratio and the forward P/E ratio. Trailing P/E ratio calculation. The trailing P/E ratio is calculated by dividing the market price per share by the earnings per share (EPS) for the past 12 months. Formula: trailing P/E ratio equals market price per share / earnings per share (EPS) for the past 12 months. Interpretation: the trailing P/E ratio reflects the market's valuation of a company's past earnings. A higher trailing P/E ratio suggests that investors are willing to pay a premium for each dollar of the company's historical earnings, indicating higher growth expectations or market optimism. Conversely, a lower trailing P/E ratio may indicate undervaluation or market pessimism. However, it is important to consider other factors and conduct thorough analysis before making investment decisions solely based on the trailing P/E ratio. Forward P/E ratio calculation. The forward P/E ratio is calculated by dividing the market price per share by the estimated earnings per share (EPS) for the next 12 months. Formula: forward P/E ratio equals market price per share / estimated earnings per share (EPS) for the next 12 months. Interpretation: the forward P/E ratio provides insight into the market's valuation of a company's expected future earnings. A higher forward P/E ratio suggests that investors are willing to pay a premium for each dollar of the company's anticipated future earnings, indicating high growth expectations or market optimism about the company's prospects. Conversely, a lower forward P/E ratio may suggest undervaluation or market pessimism. However, keep in mind that the accuracy of the forward P/E ratio relies on the reliability of analysts' earnings estimates, which can be subject to revision. When interpreting both types of P/E ratios, it is crucial to consider other factors and conduct comprehensive analysis. Factors such as industry dynamics, company-specific circumstances, management quality, competitive landscape, and macroeconomic conditions should be evaluated alongside the P/E ratio. Comparisons with industry averages or historical levels can also provide additional context. Additionally, it is important to note that P/E ratios alone do not capture the complete picture of a company's valuation and should be used in conjunction with other financial metrics and qualitative analysis.